All right, Deuteronomy 10, let's call this one circumcised, similar to the way in which we call Leviticus 26 uncircumcised. In neither case, wanting to be awkward, but using the literal metaphor that God uses for removing any barrier between what we're willing to hear and what he's trying to tell us. And so in both of these chapters, that's the metaphor he uses, this time specifically saying you need to make sure that you circumcise your heart, which means remove the covering so you can clearly hear and do the things he's counseling us into. Understand that before he gets there, though, once again, Moses is giving the history and a very emotionally taxing part of the history for him, because he's talking about the second time he had to go up to the mountain, understanding that the first time he came down, he was rudely greeted by the sight of the golden calf. In verse 1, he talks about that portion where he says, "At that time, the Lord said to me, cut for yourself 2 tablets of stone like the first, and come up to me on the mountain and make an ark of wood." Pause there. Understand, this is going to be really taxing for him, because this time he is going to have to cut the tablets of stone and walk up the mountain, as it's going to say in verse 3. "So I made an ark of acacia wood and cut 2 tablets of stone like the first, and went up the mountain with the 2 tablets in my hand." First thing is, Moses was going through it, but the lesson for all of us is, as we remember back in Numbers 12, Moses was described as the meekest man on the planet. And so we should think, if the meekest man on the planet could still, after having to go back up the mountain with 2 tablets in his hand, still be tempted to be angry enough to strike the rock after God told him to simply speak to the rock, understand how dangerous it is for each of us to be careless with the way we deal with life stress. Sometimes we talk about the passage, "Do not let the sun go down on your anger," being like a safety valve on the pressure that builds up each day. Hopefully we are taking the time to release pressure as it accumulates, so that we are not over time unaware of the toll that the things that we have to balance in life are taking on us, so that we do not strike the rocks in our lives when God is simply telling us to speak to them. Understand, we are also getting an indication of how much stress Moses was under in just these 2 short chapters, where 3 times he's going to mention this second stint on the mountain without food for 40 days and 40 nights. Again, in verse 10, he's going to say, "I myself stayed on the mountain as at the first time, 40 days and 40 nights, and the Lord listened to me that time also." The Lord was unwilling to destroy you. And understand, there are times in life where sometimes the stress isn't obvious to us, but to others it can be like, "Dude, you're repeating yourself." I've heard that a number of times. Not just normal forgetfulness, but there are times when it's a product of stress. And so I can't say that that's what's going on here with Moses, but he said it 3 times in a really short space of time. But ultimately that leads into the passage toward the end, where in verse 16 he says, "Circumcise therefore the foreskin of your heart, and be no longer stubborn." Back in Leviticus 26, when it used the term uncircumcised heart, he says, if you repent of having an uncircumcised heart, then no matter how far he has cast you away into exile, he is going to be willing to restore his covenant with you. Likewise, here, he's talking about the ways in which they can prevent being cast out of the land like the previous tenants anyway. It's by understanding the things that are important to him, just like in the first chapter when Moses is talking about appointing judges, justice and mercy, and learning to treat the sojourner with a fair standard the same way you would treat those in your own clique or your circle. And so likewise, once again, Paul has reminded us that if you are in a relationship with God that you hope ends up in that place of perfect peace, you are in a ministry of reconciliation, and that reconciliation does not happen on your own terms. And so we all live in a culture that is very different, once again, than the culture of where we're going. And to the degree we are more conformed to the way things are, that we've lost touch with the way that God has called us into a commitment to loving the people around us, a commitment to justice and equality, and a commitment to loving the foreigners among us, that in a lot of ways we have to restore our understanding of what God is calling us to do in order to restore our relationship with him, even to the degree that we've been taught that the way back to God actually involves something other than the kinds of things he's mentioning here. Once again, verse 18, he executes justice for the fatherless and the widow, and loves the sojourner, giving him food and clothing. Love the sojourner, therefore, for you were sojourners in the land of Egypt. Those are all things that he says after cautioning his people to circumcise their hearts and be no longer stubborn, but to be transformed into his image, which involves adopting his ways.